if you're perceptive and if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that we seem to have missed something. You see, in the first lesson about bonds, we talked about how there are polar and nonpolar covalent bonds, but then in the last lesson, we just talked about covalent bonds as one big group. In this lesson, we are going to clear up that misunderstanding as we talk about bonds and being nonpolar and polar. Now, oftentimes when you hear the word polar, you think of polar bears. And polar bears aren't completely unrelated to this lesson. You see, polar bears are called polar because they live near the North Pole. And why is there a North Pole? Because there are two sides, distinct ends of the Earth, because the Earth rotates, and there's the north end of the axis of rotation and the south end. Polar just refers to the fact that there are two ends of something. And I want you to keep that in mind in this lesson as we talk about things that are not polar, which means there aren't two distinct ends. So, sorry, polar bear, you are not a part of the nonpolar covalent bonds lesson. But as we get started with this, I just want you to remember that key connection that polar refers to the ends of an object that has two sides. Nonpolar means it doesn't have two distinct ends. Nonpolar covalent bonds are still covalent bonds, which means they still occur in molecules where atoms share pairs of electrons. So here's an oxygen molecule where the oxygen atoms are sharing two pairs of electrons between them to hold them together as a molecule. Here is a methane molecule where carbon with its 4 outer shell electrons is sharing one of those electrons in a pair with hydrogen, which sharing its only electron back in a pair to give carbon 8 electrons in its outer shell. And remember, hydrogen's one of those atoms that only needs 2 electrons in its outer shell. And then we have substances like this, ammonia. Ammonia, again, is a stable substance, but there's a key difference between ammonia and the other two substances pictured here. It has to do with whether they're polar or nonpolar. You see, nonpolar covalent substances have pairs of electrons that are shared completely equally throughout the molecule. Another way of understanding that is to look at the molecule itself. When you look at this oxygen molecule, you see that there are electron pairs all the way around the outside that are just evenly spread out. And what that means is there's going to be just an even negative charge around the entire outside of this oxygen molecule. The methane molecule in the middle has these hydrogens that are sharing their electrons inward, and they have a positive charge sticking out on the outside. So therefore, they're going to have this even positive charge all the way around. Now, it's not important that you're able to recognize whether they'll have negative or positive charge, but you should be able to recognize that since the atoms in the molecule are bonded in a way that they are symmetrical, they're the same on both sides, they're going to form very evenly distributed charges around the outside. Whereas ammonia has 3 hydrogen atoms that are on the bottom, and then this unshared pair of electrons on the top. That's going to cause a positive charge near the bottom and a negative charge on top. That is a polar covalent substance where the electrons are not shared evenly. Now, we're not talking about those in this lesson. We're going to focus our attention on the nonpolar covalent substances, but now you should recognize what they are. Nonpolar substances have electrons shared evenly, so the charge around the outside is uniform, whereas the polar substance has an obvious positively charged pole and a negatively charged pole. Now, as we move forward, I just want to point out sometimes atoms look like they're being shared very evenly, but they're not. This is an ozone molecule, and because an ozone molecule is made up of 3 oxygen atoms, they have to share electrons inside, sort of funny. The middle oxygen atom shares 2 pairs with one of the outside oxygens and only 1 pair with the other. And this causes an uneven distribution of electrons that gives it a slight positive charge right on the top. So sometimes it's not quite so obvious when atoms are sharing unevenly. And sometimes it's very obvious, like a water molecule, which is bent in such a way that the positively charged part is on the bottom and the negatively charged part is on the top. This causes these substances to be very polar. As I mentioned, this is not really a lesson about polar substances, it's about nonpolar substances. So let's get back to the properties of nonpolar covalent substances. When atoms in a molecule share their electrons evenly so that they have an even charge around the outside of the molecule, they have an extremely weak attraction between molecules. If the charge of the atoms in a molecule is positive all the way around the molecule, it's going to repel other positively charged molecules that are the same way around the outside. They're not going to attract them. Whereas with polar covalent molecules, those positive dipoles are positively charged, and there's negative dipoles that are negatively charged. Those are going to attract one another like sticky spots around the outside of the molecule. So nonpolar substances have little to no attraction between molecules. They also have very, very low melting and boiling points as a consequence of having no attraction for one another. Usually, nonpolar substances are gases at room temperature or maybe liquids. Sometimes they can form solids, but there has to be some other things going on for that to happen. The atoms and molecules aren't really attracted to one another, so because they aren't attracted, they don't really stick together. And then lastly, nonpolar substances tend to dissolve in other nonpolar substances, but not in polar substances. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at why they don't dissolve in polar substances, and in a future lesson, we'll take a look at why they do dissolve, sort of, in nonpolar substances. Now, let's just take a look at these properties while looking at some actual examples of nonpolar covalent substances. You can see that the entire molecule basically has the same charge around the outside, or at least has opposite charges evenly distributed around the molecule. These molecules, because they have the same charge around the outside, aren't going to want to stick to other molecules with that same charge around the outside. Oxygen doesn't like to stick to other oxygen molecules because they're both negatively charged around the outside. They actually repel one another. Just like methane doesn't like to stick to other methanes. And nitrogen, while it does have some positive and negative potential sticky spots around the outside, they cancel each other out because they're evenly distributed on both sides of the molecule. But why do these substances not dissolve in water? Well, that can be answered by actually taking a look at water molecules and considering that these are polar molecules. Polar molecules do have negative and positive sticky spots, and they like to stick together. Even when water molecules are in their liquid form, they still form attractions between the positively charged hydrogen parts and the negatively charged oxygen parts. There's going to be temporary sort of strong attractions between those parts that pull water together as a substance. When we try to put a nonpolar substance in water, like oxygen, because the oxygen is not attracted to any part of the water, really, what's going to happen is the water is going to squeeze together because it is attracted, and it's going to squeeze the oxygen right out of its attractedness. So the oxygen is going to be moved to one place, and the water is going to remain in the other. That's why nonpolar substances aren't dissolved by polar substances, because the polar substances squeeze together, and they squeeze the nonpolar substances out. So now you know what makes a substance nonpolar. The covalent pairs of electrons that are shared between atoms are shared evenly throughout the molecules, so there's no places that are more positively or negatively charged that are going to allow it to stick to other molecules. And you also know some properties of nonpolar substances, that they are weakly attracted, very low melting and boiling points, and they do not dissolve in polar substances like water.